Welcome to this series, Photoshop for Beginners. The first one in the series, and I'll put links down below, was navigating around Photoshop. The second one was about using Adobe Camera Raw, and this one is about using adjustment layers. If you saw my first video in this series, which is called Photoshop for Beginners, I walked you around the various parts of this interface, introducing the menus up here, the tools over here, and all these dialog boxes and how you get them up on the screen. And that basically is through this window drop down. As you can see, we've got history, histogram, and layers, and you can see those over here as well as adjustments. Now, you can actually go over here instead and just go image, adjustments if you want to make some adjustments on this image, and choose one of these actions and start working away. What that's going to do is destructively make those changes to this background layer. So in other words, if you save this file out, anything that you had done from this image adjustments dropdown would be baked into that file. And if you closed it and then open it again, you wouldn't be able to undo some of those actions if you didn't like them later. So that's where the adjustments layers come in. And I'm just going to show you something here. I'm going to start with probably the most complex layer, and that's called, or adjustment layer, I should say, and that's called curves. And what curves does is allows you to adjust the tone in various parts of the image. And in this particular image, as you can see, we've got a very dark bowl or crater here. And most of that information, as the histogram reveals here, is kind of located at the bottom end of the histogram, which you'd expect. As you can see by this scale, this is the dark end of our image, and this is the bright end of our image. And you can see there's not that much information, surprisingly, at the high end of our image, or the highlight end of our image, of our histogram. And you'd think, looking at this, that you'd see, a lot of information up here, but we're not. So one thing we can do, you'll notice right now there's this 45-degree line. If we just take our, again, starting up here with this move tool, you can just click on it and start clicking on the curve. You notice it moves a bit when we do that, because if I don't click right on the line, it will pull the line up or down. So let's start just by putting a number of what's typically called anchor points along here. And I'll show you what happens if I start moving one of these anchor points. So if I move this up, what that's saying is that the output now is higher than the original input level for that tonal level. So in other words, we're working down at in the darkest part of the image, because we're at the bottom end of the histogram. And you can see that tends to bring up the all this dark area a little bit, but you don't want to go too far. I'll tell you why. Here's what happens if you pull one of these handles too hard. You start getting this really cartoonish look. So the rule of thumb when you're working with curves is just keep the curve as smooth as possible. Now, also, I can say go up to the high end of this of the histogram and start working up there, see what effect that's going to have. And you can see on the foreground there that the bush, it does have a little bit of an effect on it. That's where all the highlight information is. The higher I go up, obviously the more it's going to attack the brighter parts of the image. So we might just try that for the moment. Now we're going to just add another adjustment layer here, and that won't affect this curves layer. We're going to leave that as is. And I'm going to go over here and just go to brightness. No, sorry. I'm going to go to exposure. So I know it's hidden our layers panel again, so I'm just going to click on it. There it is. And you can see it's dropped an additional layer on top of the curves layer and on top of our background layer, of course. And the adjustments we get in here are exposure. I can move the entire histogram up or down by using the exposure or this offset control, but all I need right now is to adjust what's called gamma correction. And gamma correction basically works on the low end of the histogram to punch up values at the low end of the histogram. So it's without affecting the high end. So as you can see, as I drag this along, it's just brightening and effectively washing out the image if you go too far. So I'm going to go to around there. So now, just so you know, layers can be shut on and off, or at least the effect of those layers can be shut on and off just by clicking these eyeball icons. In fact, I can shut off the original, which is not very helpful because these are just adjustment layers. They're not additional images on top of our original background layer. So by shutting off the curve, you can see even with this exposure layer where we've adjusted the gamma correction, it's still, and we take out the gamma correction, that shows you what the original looks like. So if we add these back in, there's our gamma correction, which brightens the darkest areas a little bit, and then our curves, which has more of a dramatic effect. So at this point you might be wondering, well, why is this any different from doing these adjustments on the background layer itself? What am I going to do with these layers? How do I save a file with those layers? Well, you should typically either save it in the native format, which is .psd. So if we go up here and say File, Save As, it'll ask us where we want to save them, and you'll notice we have some choices here, lots of choices, but only certain file types will save with the layers, and TIFF is one of those, and that's this one, and also PSD, which is the Photoshop native format. So for sure those ones will save with layers, and when you go and save that file, it will tell you, layers will increase the size of the saved file, and that's fine, just accept that. And the benefit of that is the next time that you open up this image after you've saved it with the layers, you will still see these layers here. And if you go, oh, I don't really like what I saw or what I did, I'm going to, maybe right click on that layer and just say delete it. I'm not going to do that right now, but you can then go back and start all over again. Now, this history down here, you can see this is what the file looked like when we opened it up. And if I go down to the bottom of this list, click on that, it shows me all the changes we've made up until the end. Unfortunately, this history doesn't come back with the file once you've saved it, closed it, and then you've opened it again. So one other little thing I'm going to do here, because this now looks like a somewhat flat file, when I say flat, it looks low contrast. So let's make another layer on top of the existing layer there, or the top layer that was already there. And again, we have to find our layers. So there's the brightness contrast. I was clicked on this exposure layer before I went onto here and clicked on here. So it ends up dropping that new layer on top of whatever last layer you were clicked on. So with that, this is a fairly simple thing. I'm not looking to necessarily increase the brightness here, but I think let's see what happens if we try to increase the contrast a bit. So it makes it look a little bit more punchy. I wouldn't go too far with it. It's just another improvement to our image. Now, you notice as I click through these layers, I'm going to click down to the exposure layer. This properties box changes to whatever layer you're clicked on. Now that I've clicked on the curves layer again, over here I see my original curve that I set up. There's some other controls along the side here. These ones are eyedropper icons, and what it means is if you click on that particular one, which sets the black level or the black point, the darkest point on your histogram, if you clicked on a spot down here after clicking on that, it would shift the entire histogram down so that that point now became the blackest point in the image. Similarly, this one sets it to the white point and this one sets it to a gray point. But what I've found is that they're a little too radical. It's very difficult to find the part of the image that you definitely want to set to, say, the black point and have it go there. It usually makes it much too dark. So I'd avoid that for the moment. But there is an interesting little one here. If you click on this and then go over to your image, you notice you've got an eyedropper here. But if I go into the bright part of this bush, click on it, it changes to a hand with up and down arrows, and it means it now actually puts a point, as you can see up on the histogram, at that brightness level, whatever you're clicked on, and you can now just roll up and down and make that that point brighter or darker just by dragging it up or down. So for instance, I could go in here, click on it, push up and down, and it's going crazy, of course, because it's not a smooth curve, but it's actually put another anchor point on the curve, and everything is kind of wriggling around that the next anchor point up, which is this one, as this one is adjusted. So that's why we want to put, by the way, more and more anchor points along here, so that if I make an adjustment here, you notice there's very little below that point or to this side of that point that is going to move, because those are anchoring the curve at that point. Up to this point, we've just touched on layers. Layers are actually used for more than what we're seeing here. This is for adjusting the qualities of an image, the brightness and in various parts of the image and so on. Layers are actually used for something called compositing, and that I'll get into in a bit more detail in another video, a subsequent video to this one. But there's another concept related to layers, and that's called masks. And again, the masks are very important when you're doing compositing of several images, one on top of another. They allow you to control how much of each image on each separate layer is revealed and becomes part of the final image. But here we can apply that same kind of concept. You notice up here it gives you another icon. We've got the curves icon, and this one is called masks. And these squares over that you see on the right hand side on the layers panel are actually the masks, and we can actually draw within those masks and have a selective effect on what we've done within that, let's say within that layer. So we're clicked on the curves layer now, and we're going to put we're going to paint within a mask on that curves layer. So in order to do that, we have to go over here to the brush tool, just a simple brush tool. Excuse me, and if you look down here, we have a black and a white patch, which we can just by hitting this double arrow, we can make it foreground, background kind of thing. So we want to start with, make sure this black is in the foreground. And what I'm going to show you is by making sure we have this box around that mask there. And I'm going to go up here. I've got a way too big a brush. I'm going to use this dialog box to bring the size of that brush down. Okay, that's something I can work with. And I'm going to leave it at sort of 50% hardness. And that just defines how hard or soft the edge of the brush is, as you can see by these kind of examples here. And now what I'm going to do is start painting within my image. And you notice, let's say this is a feature that I didn't really want to brighten up. Now I've brightened this whole region up with the curves layer, but there's one part I might say, no, I don't want that to be such a bright feature. So now you can see I've darkened it a bit, and you'll see this density slider. As I move it, it will actually reduce the amount of that effect. And there's an, let's set it back to 100%. So now what I wanted to show you also is up here in this little box, you see that little dark stripe that shows where I've painted, and you can see over here on the layers panel in that mask box, you can see that same stripe. Now I could just, for demonstration purposes, say I don't want this part of the image to be bright either, so I'm going to kind of paint it out. And you can see again, that's extended the amount of dark area within this curves mask area. And so if I now adjust this feathering control, you'll see that it controls the softness of the edge of that area that I've excluded. To take this example a little further, I'm going to now work on this area. This is maybe considered too bright an area for the image when compared to the rest of it. So again, if I take the brush and I make sure that I am in the curves mask area, and I've got a black patch there, and my brush is at the right size, I can just start kind of taking this down by just painting around it. I'm not actually painting it black. What I'm doing is I'm selecting an area within the mask that says remove the effect of the curves layer or the curves adjustments that we just did, and just on this area alone. So if there were no adjustments at all, in other words, if we still had just a 45-degree line without any of these adjustments, adjusting or painting within the layer mask would have no effect at all, because it's saying that you haven't made any adjustments to the curves, so we're not going to do anything about it. And the same applies to all these other layer masks or layer adjustment layers as well, and their masks. So for instance, if we take exposure, click on that layer now, you'll excuse me, it's got to be again highlighted like that. If we look at what we did on that layer, we did this gamma correction, and that was basically to bring up this dark area. Well, we might decide we want to leave some part of this sort of darkish, or again. So same concept. We can go into the layer mask, pick a brush, and let's say I want to keep this part of the image still dark. You notice it is darkening up, and what it's doing is it's completely taking out in that area of the image, or that part of the image, any effect that the gamma correction that we applied through the exposure layer is applying. And now I can also soften that edge a little bit by running up the feather adjustments. And by the way, there's this select and mask. That's a way of refining some of the shape of this mask that we've now painted in. But we're going to leave that for now. It gets a little too complex. Similarly, I could click now on the brightness adjustment layer, and see what we did. Well, what we did was we adjusted contrast alone. This one might be a little harder to show the effect of, but we can also go make sure we're clicked on its mask, and we'll start painting out whatever effect that had. And I think, yeah, you can probably see some, yep, right there in that foreground where I'm painting now. You can see it's taking out that contrast effect just in those areas where I'm painting. And indeed, at the end of the exercise here, you can see that each mask has an individual area where I've painted. They're totally independent of each other. So in this top layer, I'm only adjusting or taking out whatever adjustment I did in the brightness and contrast panel, just in this area that I was just painting. And in the exposure layer, I'm taking out gamma correction that was done in this area. And in the curves layer, I'm taking out any effects in this highlighted area, or this bright area, taking out any effects that were created on this curve. And again, if I made no adjustments in any of these adjustments layers, and I tried to paint within the mask, nothing would happen, because it's basically saying you have to have made an adjustment on this adjustment layer before we'll let you selectively take out parts of the image that were affected by that adjustment. And just a quick tip, if you've opened up an adjustment layer and you see this properties box looking small and puny like that, just go to the corner, give it a drag outward. There's a maximum size that it will give you on that curves box, but at least it's a bit more visible. So after having reviewed the content in this video, you might be wondering, why wouldn't I just do this stuff in Lightroom? And indeed, you can do it in Lightroom. The only difference is that within, as you saw, layers, adjustment layers, where you maybe say set up a curve or something like that, that you can select parts of the image where you don't want that curve to affect the image in that very spot. You can't do any such thing in Lightroom because Lightroom does not support masks or layers for that matter. So the masks are quite a handy thing, and that's, I think, what distinguishes Photoshop from Lightroom, is the ability to use layers and then selectively with the masks determine what part of the image is affected by that layer, that adjustment layer in this case. You'll notice there were a lot more icons within that adjustment layers panel that you could have explored. I'm going to leave that up to you. I just wanted to show you the principle of using layers and or adjustment layers specifically, and the masks. And so go forth and have some fun with this. Thrash around Photoshop and see what you can do. So if you found this content useful in any way, I'd appreciate one of these. And if you didn't like it, of course, I'm going to have to put up with these if you feel so inclined. But more than anything, I'd love it if you would subscribe and maybe even hit that notification bell so that when I do the next one in this series, number 4, you'll be notified. Thanks for watching.